There we go. A very, very warm welcome to everybody that is watching us live and everybody that will be joining us afterwards and watching the recording. So thank you all so much for taking the time to be part of this, to be present with this, to be interested in this. I'm definitely interested in this, and I had the absolute pleasure of interviewing Edwin already for the Global Existential Summit 4. Can't believe it's number 4 already, but we've already had the chance to meet and speak a little bit about this. And after that conversation, I was like, I want to hear more about what you're talking about, Edwin. So I've managed to, well, indeed, Edwin has so kindly and generously decided to take me up on that idea and share more about what he's been working on, as you were just saying, Edwin, for the last 10 years. This has been a massive, massive project coming together. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction. Dr. Edwin Murillo is an associate professor in the Modern and Classical Languages and Literatures Department at the University of Tennessee-Chattanooga. I realize I don't know how to say that word. Can you help me with that word?
Certainly, Chattanooga.
Chattanooga. University of Tennessee-Chattanooga. Amazing. He is also the director of the Latin American Studies. He's the author of a short story collection called Midnight Vallenato and Latin America and Existentialism, which is the book I think we're going to be focusing on today. He's a former soccer player and loves Bossa Nova, travel, and the Star Wars universe. He loves the beach in Belize, which I very much do too, and the coffee in Colombia. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing this time. And please feel free to add anything to the introduction that I've missed. And please feel free to take it away whenever you're ready, Edwin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Thank you all for being here this evening for y'all. It's afternoon for me. It's about 1 o'clock or just past 1 o'clock for me. I am very appreciative of this opportunity to Dr. Fraser. And as she mentioned before, our conversation was so positive and interesting that the time flew right by, and it didn't feel like an interview at all. It felt like just a conversation amongst friends. And I'm hoping for that same sort of energy this afternoon. What I'll be doing is I'll be discussing the final chapter in my book. I have synthesized that conclusion, and I also have a PowerPoint. I live with PowerPoints. I'm a professor, so I have a PowerPoint that I think will help visualize some of the ideas that helped energize this particular project. So once again, my deepest gratitude to Dr. Fraser and to you all for being here this afternoon. And if there aren't any initial questions, I'll just get going. So as I mentioned, what I've done is I've shortened up my concluding chapter to my book, and I should get through this reading in about 20 to 25 minutes, and afterwards I'd be more than happy to start a conversation. And actually I'm kind of hoping to have some suggestions because I have a second project that I'm working on now that I would be more than happy to get some help on. So, Latin America and its malcontents. Historically, to place a nationality to existentialism, especially in a European context, has been considered kosher. Thus, to speak of French, Russian, or German existentialism has been a productive and consistent critical approach for decades. So too has the tendency to attach surnames to existentialism. For example, existentialism a la Dostoevsky, Sartre, Camus, and even Woody Allen. Unfortunately, the same historical consciousness has not been extended to Latin America. Nevertheless, existentialism has been a part of our world for decades. For example, there are ideas captured in film. I think we all recognize these movies. Bergman's classic and Harold Ramis's Groundhog Day, and Kurosawa's classic 1950 film Ikuru. Moods are also expressed in art, Edvard Munch's classic work. Of course, philosophy, literature, without, of course, forgetting sculptures. Alberto Giacometti's Walking Man from the 1960s. And here I am with the Walking Man last week in Chicago. I actually came upon Giacometti's sculpture by accident, and I was too excited to be taking a selfie with this very important artifact of existentialism. In short, existentialism has infused our cultures. Existentialism, it appears, is everywhere, including Latin America. And of course, Rodin's patron saint of introspection, the poet or the thinking man. I'd like to introduce you to two new figures that maybe you all have not ever seen before. These are sculptures from Latin America. Both seem to be, let's say, copies or renditions of Rodin's statue. However, the one on the left is actually Native American. It's housed at the Colombian Museum of Gold, and it's known as the Pensador Precolombino, the Colombian thinker. And it's from the Tumaco Iguapi people and dates to about 700 before the Common Era, which, as you might imagine, is fascinating. The statue, the sculpture on the right is Fernando Botero, also a famous Colombian artist. Naturally, one of the objectives of my book has been to place the adjective Latin American on existentialism. I have endeavored to accomplish this by studying existentialism within a Hispanic American and Brazilian context. Moreover, always from a comparative point of view, to confirm our presence in terms of motifs, poetics, and simultaneousness with the canonical figures. A necessary enterprise, given that most studies assume that Latin American existentialism is a post-1940s phenomenon. Latin American existentialism traced existential attitudes beginning in Brazil in the 19th century, making its way through the Colombian Andes, then going back to Brazil after passing through Cuba and Chile. At each stop, and this is a Machado de Assis from Brazil, José Asunción Silva from Colombia, Enrique Labrador Ruiz from Cuba, Maria Elisa Bombal from Chile, and Graciliano Ramos from Brazil. At each stop, I have brought Latin American philosophical voices into the existentialism discussion. I have looked to draw on comparisons. Thus, the Latin Americans I focus on dealt with problems of anxiety, despair, nothingness, and humanity's orphanhood. As I have argued throughout this book, all the protagonists have struggled with their burden of freedom, while also confronting their respective feelings of existential insufficiency. There is a shared commitment and treatment of issues concerning free will, choice, bad faith, and rebellion. I have also preferred to conceptualize Latin America's presence as part of a long existentialist story at whose core is an incessant will to overcome. Nonetheless, I must stress that this book is representational. It is a synecdoche of presence that begins to reclaim that begins to reclaim a space for Latin America in existentialism. As such, it is neither conclusive nor exhaustive. If we consider that the Latin American narratives studied here respond to an individual malcontentment, then we can understand that the anxiety about the inconsequential existence of each protagonist has leads them to search out new adventures. Dread of orphanhood and anguish of irrelevance provoke each anti-hero towards action and self-realization. The effect of these existential moments play out as quest narratives in several of Machado de Asis's short stories and in Labrador Ruiz and Graciliano Ramos, or as deep ruminations on the human condition, as happens with Asunción Silva and Maria Luisa Bombal. Of particular interest when it comes to Machado de Assis is his humorous misanthropy, as manifest in his foundational Memorias Póstumas de Brás Cubas from 1881. Specifically, I am talking about the protagonist's delirium or dream, as the chapter is known. Machado visits the idea of the eternal recurrent desolation of existence. This celebrated chapter is of existential importance because it depicts the apathetic and brutal quality of life while underscoring the self-centered tendencies of the individual, leading Brás Cubas, the protagonist, firstly to despair at this truth, but eventually to laugh defiantly at such irrationality. Furthermore, in turning away from merely despairing at the catastrophe that is human existence, Machado's mad philosopher, Quincas Borba, who's also a character in the book, provides a vitalist recommendation to the protagonist that resonates with other advocates of the earthly. Thus, when Brás Cubas begins to despair at all the inequities in his life, his friend, the philosopher Borbas, admonishes him. And I quote, this is Borba speaking to the protagonist. He tells him to fight, conquer, dominate, savor life. Another example we can find is the protagonist of Machado's famous big wig theory. Here, the protagonist reminds his son, and I quote the father in the story, speaking to the son, that's life. There's no use whining or cursing. We must just accept things as they are, with their burdens and misfortunes, glories and disparagements, and press on regardless. Close the quote. To press on regardless was one of the many deciphering virtues of Machado de Assis. In so many of his writings, Machado, the interpreter of the Latin American existential soul, found, if not deliverance, certainly humor and perseverance. Yes, paradox and perseverance, mainstays of the human condition, embodies so much of the Brazilian's existential worldview and forms part of Machado's own existential truth-telling. The Colombian Jose Asuncion Silva's existential truth-telling is likewise interested in advocating the earthly, aligning the Colombian with Machado and with Nietzsche. While Machado's sublime misanthropy was directed at the hypocrisy of appearances and on inauthenticity, Asuncion Silva is more focused on the ascetic ideal and herd mentality. Asuncion Silva promoted the earthly by espousing and living these as virtues vicariously through his own Colombian Übermensch, Jose Fernandez, the protagonist. Indeed, Fernandez, as the symbol of authentic being, required naturally a metamorphosis. And similar to other existential texts that I discuss in this book, physical ailments stand in for spiritual malaise. And the ensuing tribulations suffered on account of that illness represent the journey towards physical and spiritual wellness. As such, the Sobremesa documents the many ineffectual attempts by the protagonist to overcome that malaise through socially accepted normative means, namely medicine, therapy, and even love. In the Sobremesa, the protagonist's anguished existence does not turn for the better until he reconciles with his burden of freedom. This process of self-accountability becomes evident through several dialogues and soliloquies. Fernandez's dialogues are especially valuable for understanding the story of that metamorphosis, and for understanding the causes that made such life transformations necessary. Each encounter with a character in the book provides insight into Fernandez's troubles or are the pretext for the protagonist to expand on his own interpretations of the human condition. Ultimately, the Sobremesa is a novel that remains, to quote Nietzsche, faithful to the earth and proclaims to the reader, be yourself. With Labrador Ruiz's El laberinto de sí mismo, I discussed the protagonist's existential crisis, which turned to death as an answer. Labrador Ruiz's novel can be understood as the repurposing of the Minotaur myth, wherein the protagonist struggles to reconcile with his most monstrous yet authentic self. Ultimately, it is the love interest, Teresa, who truth tells the protagonist towards his most confrontational existential moments, antagonizing him until he recognizes the fallacy of his own inauthentic life and indirectly to accepting the virtues of surrendering to his innermost demons. Almost inevitably, the protagonist decides to realize his authentic poetic voice by annihilating the inauthentic image he saw reflected in Teresa. This realization is put into radical motion by condemning that reflection to silence, which the poet carries out by committing suicide. It would seem that Labrador Ruiz's novel is a radical answer to the series of questions made famous by a certain Danish prince. I am, of course, referring to Hamlet. It is as if to Hamlet's questions, Labrador Ruiz's poet answers with a resounding no. With Maria Luisa Bombal's novel, the existential focus is on rebelliousness as ethos. As I argued in Bombal's novels, the use of sensuality, adultery, memory, writing, and ambiguity generated a masochistic space of fulfillment. In La Última Niebla and La Amortajada, willful disobedience, confrontational questioning of normative behaviors, and desire are constitutive forces. Both of Bombal's anti-heroines, through their words and their actions, adhere to and indirectly promote confrontation with life. Each protagonist was a complicit, desiring subject, and the novels showcase them as existential malcontents, time and again manifesting their unwillingness to surrender fully to societal expectations. In the case of the anonymous narrator of Bombal's first novel, La Última Niebla, she rejects the trivial existence of a proxy second wife. Her willfulness foreshadows not the eventual triumph of her hypocritical surroundings, but rather her continued resistance, her appeal to an ethics of sexuality and ambiguity as an existential attitude. In La Amortajada, Ana Maria, the protagonist, is revealed to have been an egocentric, desiring being, regularly affronting the essentialist foundations of her religion and the normative demands of her patronizing bourgeoisie. Bombal's novels narrativize existential malcontent as sexual and sensual consciousness and cynical resistance. In the process, the reader witnesses the subjective agency of both anti-heroines. In my view, Graciliano Ramos's Angustia, anguish, was the most abject representation of existential problems in this book. Although several prominent critics characterize Luis da Silva, the protagonist, as a sociopath, at its core, the novel provided the reader access to the protagonist's overt struggles with his freedom and his growing sense of alienation, based on the realization of his anonymity. Anguish narrativized a revenge story through existential parameters. Or to put it differently, Da Silva, the protagonist, chose himself, privileging in the act of murder his right to exist, then enacted his choice and suffered the repercussions in the form of an illness that both opened and closed the novel. Anguish is an absurd narrative because an existentially attuned contradiction is at work. Although Luis was repulsed by the ethical bankruptcy which surrounded him, he longed to be part of that hypocrisy. Even when dehumanized by that consumerist world, he desired it. Although Luis would have the readership accept his victimization as justification for his heinous acts, Anguish ultimately unveiled the existentialist position that, and I quote Sartre here, the destiny of man is placed within himself. I argued that Luis's confessions were symptomatic of that responsibility. In other words, Luis was cognizant of his freedom and acted out accordingly, even when he attempted to portray himself as a victim. Underpinning Anguish's concealment of being, or his own bad faith, was Luis's awareness that the world had always been chaotic, absurd, and indifferent towards him. He ultimately did attempt to confront the chaos of his existence. However, Da Silva sought to evade responsibility for his choices and his actions. In the end, in the reading, Luis da Silva is the embodiment of the absurdity of the human condition. The stories of Latin America and existentialism take up the crisis of insufficiency, intensified by an inkling that humanity is utterly alone. This existential orphanhood manifested as portrayals of an indifferent universe in Machado, Labrador Ruiz and Bombal, or as the triumph of the unjust, the unworthy, or the amoralists, as in Machado's short stories and the novels of Graciliano Ramos and Asuncion Silva. In short, the fictional lives of the protagonists studied in my book define what it means to become aware of that solitude and that freedom. The absence of an overarching meaning to the universe drove the protagonists to confront their existence through action. In each instance, this action-reaction was a harrowing experience. Unquestionably, the existentialist type lives on well into the 21st century. Jonathan Judkin explains that existentialism, and I quote, remains germane because our very humanity is such that humans are the beings that continue to ask, what is the meaning of my existence? Close the quote. Likewise, easily recognizable existentialist themes and characters populate cultural artifacts across generations, national borders, languages, genres, and artistic expressions. Existential terminology peppers conventional conversational languages. As a result, existentialism has become intrinsic to our cultural subconscious. This cultural fusion explains the uncanny familiarity and continued presence of existential footprints. In film, the existential type lives on in the aforementioned Groundhog Day and The Seventh Seal, as well as in Fight Club and The Matrix, and even in the Disney universe. Short films like Inner Workings or longer films like Soul, all of these are impacted by existentialness. Even pop culture. For example, Dr. Rick Sanchez of Rick and Morty infamy disabuses his granddaughter by affirming, and I quote Dr. Sanchez, there is no God, Summer. You got to rip that Band-Aid off now. You'll thank me for it later. The viewership of Rick and Morty need not have digested any existentialism classics to appreciate an oddly familiar philosophical ethos. Latin America, naturally, has not been the exception. A brief visualization brings to bear the social engagement and anguished depiction of the human condition in the work of the Ecuadorian Osvaldo Guayasamín from Ecuador, Native American, as well as the Brazilian Tarsila do Amaral in her work Abaparu from 1928. Guayasamíl's work is from the 1960s. Tarsila do Amaral's from the 1920s. Likewise, Brazilian films like Luis Sergio Person's São Paulo, Sociedade Anônima, and José Enrique Fonseca's O Homem do Ano, The Man of the Year from 2003, deal directly with humanity's search for relevance. So too is existentialism's shadow overt in Sebastian Hoffman's gender-bending zombie film, Haley from 2012. This is a Mexican film. Other visualizations of the existential bring to mind Kino's Argentine comic Mafalda, in particular Mafalda's resident provocateur, Miguelito, who offers the most noteworthy existentially perceptive moments. For example, when Miguelito envisions the ramifications of life, imagining the different stages of life, from childhood through adulthood, ultimately ending with him content in heaven, such idealism elicits one word: lies. And Miguelito's 5 years old here. Other manifestations of existentialist presence can be easily verified by the endless interest in academia. Hence, we can speak of new adjectives for existentialism. For example, cybernetic existentialism, virtual existentialism, and non-humanist existentialism, as well as 21st century feminist existentialism. Latin America is not far behind. We have journalistic existentialism coming out of Mexico. We have a philosophical study of a writer, Clarice Lispector. She did not write any philosophical text per se. She was a prose and short story writer, but she has been looked at from a philosophical perspective. And then we have a Luis Rionda Arriaguin from Mexico, who actually provides some neo-existentialism essays here in the 21st century. In conjunction, all these manifestations appear to substantiate William McBride's assertion that, and I quote, in several areas of culture and society, the existentialist type lives on. To close, I decided to revisit the meaning of the Colombian thinker. The Colombian thinker reminded me that all the voices heard in Latin America and existentialism seem to agree that humanity is perpetually anguished. It is destined to die, burdened by freedom and orphaned. In fact, the thinker's long, fixed stare seems to peer into nothingness, into a vacuum with no irrefutable certitudes. In Situating Existentialism from 2012, George Kotkin also speaks of existentialism's die-hard relevance. As he explains, and I am quoting Professor Kotkin, our world of the 21st century is pockmarked by meaninglessness, absurdity, and violence masked by the languages of certitude. Americans, perhaps more than ever, cling to certainty, whether it comes from fundamentalist religion or from their own gut feelings. If this such is indeed our condition, then existentialist truth-telling is more needed than ever. Professor Kotkin is, of course, entirely right. And although Kotkin's words are directed squarely at the United States, these same affirmations apply to all malcontents throughout the Americas, whether in Bolsonaro's authoritative Brazil, Maduro's Venezuela, a socialist nightmare, communist Cuba, or any other space of the post-truth world. Indeed, it would seem today that existentialism's truth-telling is more needed than ever before. And Latin America and Existentialism, with its literary topography of normative fallacies, apathy, and absurdity, and the malcontents' struggle for meaning within this landscape, deals with several manifestations of this necessary truth-telling. Given of the above, the Colombian thinker is my preferred symbol for existentialism in Latin America. I take the thinker as a reminder that God's silences have bequeathed the individual with solitude and freedom, so choose well or don't. With the thinker, I am reminded that the universe could not care less. However, I am also reminded that death is the great equalizer. So laugh insolently like Bras Cuba, live as dangerously as Jose Fernandez and Luis da Silva, and make no excuses like Ana Maria, or don't. Finally, as this was a representative account of our foundational years, I am obliged to agree one final time with Stephen Crowell when he insists, and I quote Professor Crowell, "It may be that what we have most to learn from existentialism still lies before us." I hope that Latin America and existentialism's legacy becomes this basic act of truth-telling, that this book becomes a building block, proposing that what still lies before us is a further mapping out of Latin America's contributions, not only to the past, but also to the present of existentialism's story. And I'll leave you all with one final nugget of wisdom from my very good friend, Friedrich Nietzsche. Believe me that the secret for harvesting from existence the greatest fruitfulness and the greatest enjoyment is to live dangerously. Build your cities on the slopes of Vesuvius and send your ships into uncharted seas. Thank you so much, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Edwin. That was amazing. I've never seen anybody do their slides like that with just photo and then photo, and it's just so, I don't even know how you did that, but it was so beautifully, what's the word? It just really complimented the words that you were saying. It really brought it to life for me, so thank you so much. I just kind of sat here flabbergasted about how intense it must have been for you to put this book together and this project together. You've just not just casually glanced at all of these books and all of these stories, but you've just engaged with them so profoundly. And so on behalf of everybody that gets to see this presentation and also hopefully read your book if they're interested, I want to thank you for putting in all of that work and allowing us to have these, big nuggets of really valuable truth without having to do all of the reading ourselves. So thank you so much for that.
I mentioned that the focus of the book is primarily literature and that I supplement my readings with philosophical perspectives. Naturally, the usual suspects are there, Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, Sartre, de Beauvoir, Nietzsche, Pascal, etc. But I also was able to, and I think this is a corollary of my work, I was able to rescue some Latin American philosophers that have fallen into obscurity, not only in the United States, but in Latin America. And if you'll humor me, I actually have a slide of that as well. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for humoring me for the last 25 minutes. But these are some of the philosophical texts that appear in my book. Fernando González Ochoa, Pensamientos de un Viejo. None of these texts have been translated. So in my book is in English. So all the translations in the book are mine. So Pensamientos de un Viejo would translate roughly to an old man's thinking, and it's from 1914. So Fernando González Ochoa is from Colombia. Raimundo de Farias Brito is Brazilian. O Mundo Interior, The Interior World, from 1916. The Existential Game, Carlos Estrada from Argentina, 1933, I believe. towards a new humanism. Oh, I stand corrected. This has been translated. Samuel Ramos from Mexico in 1940. And then the collected works of Clarence Finlayson, who's from Chile. Really interesting. Most of his work is from the 40s and 50s. A Chilean philosopher who, again, was more famous in Colombia. He worked as a professor at a couple of universities in Colombia. So he's more famous in Colombia, but still forgotten, which means he has very little footprints in Chile, which is interesting because he's Chilean. So these are some of the voices that appear in the book as well. Oh my goodness, I almost forgot. Vicente Ferreira da Silva also publishes in the 40s and 50s from Brazil. But again, be happy to, answer questions, um, engage in a larger conversation.